Good morning and welcome to the first of EMPA's free pre-conference webinars. I'm Phil Campbell and I'm the chair of this year's Emergency Media and Public Affairs Conference. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gundungurra and Tharawal people. First, some technical information. If you've attended an EMPA webinar previously or last year's virtual conference, you may notice the addition today of an Auslan interpreter, provided by Sweeney Interpreting, who will remain on screen at all times during this webinar, as well as the closed captions being provided by Bradley Reporting. The captions should automatically appear on your screen. If you do not see these, please jump into the chat and we'll attempt to troubleshoot. Because of the viewing requirements, any slides that are shown will not appear as full screen. If you're unable to read the slides at any time, be aware that they'll be made available to download alongside the recording following the webinar. You can jump on the chat panel at any time to talk to the panelists and to your fellow participants. Just be sure to have all panelists and attendees selected at the top of your chat window so that everyone will see your comment. After the presentation today, there'll be a Q&A session. Type in your questions to the Q&A panel and I'll read those out to our presenters on your behalf. If you have any issues or questions and can't access the chat, shoot us through an email. The address is conferences@empa.org.au. On to today's webinar. Today's webinar is Getting It Right, Tailoring Communications and Engagement between Disability Groups and Emergency Management. We're going to hear from two speakers today, Leyla Craig and Sean Sweeney from Sweeney Interpreting. First to Sean. Sean has become one of the most recognisable faces in Australian media since leading the Auslan interpreting team during the 2019-20 bushfires in New South Wales. He'll share his experiences and perspectives on interpreting emergency news on TV. Leyla Craig is a PhD candidate from Sydney University. As a practitioner in disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, Leyla has been involved in local and international projects focusing on deaf communities in Australia and Southeast Asia. Her work involves exploring the underlying causes and gaps that exist between deaf communities, disability groups and emergency services, as well as identifying sustainable solutions that meet the specific needs of different disability groups within the disaster and risk space. The personal lived experiences as a deaf person and the disconnects seen between deaf communities as well as disability groups and emergency services has led her to become a PhD research candidate at the University of Sydney, focusing on deaf communities and organisations' capacities to respond to and support those affected by hazards and disasters. At present, Leyla's working on disability inclusion with Fire and Rescue New South Wales. I'd like to start though by introducing Sean Sweeney.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for that great introduction. I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Yuin people. That's Y-U-I-N, in the Jervis Bay district on the south coast of New South Wales. Now, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Sweeney. I'm the co-owner of Sweeney Interpreting. Our business has been around for about 7 years now. And you're probably thinking, oh, how does someone become an Auslan interpreter? Well, in my case, my family are deaf. I've got great-grandparents who are deaf, my grandparents who are deaf, my parents who are deaf, and extended family who are deaf. So did I become an interpreter very early on in my career? No, I didn't. I actually didn't become an interpreter until in my mid-30s. I decided to become an interpreter because of, I had a bit of a midlife crisis at the time. Anyhow, that's enough about me. Look, I'm here, I've been invited here to talk to you about my experience with the 2019/2020 bushfires in New South Wales. I received a phone call one day. I was getting ready to go on holidays, and I received this phone call from the RFS. They were looking for an Auslan interpreter, and after my conversation with the media team at the RFS in Homebush, I decided that, yep, okay, then I'll take the job on. So the next morning I went in at 6 a.m. and I got in there nice and early, ready for a 7 o'clock broadcast. And mind you, remember, this is my first time I'd ever worked in a broadcasting setting. So I approached the media team and I asked them for some preparation for some sort of information going forward. And because it was new to everybody, they couldn't give me the preparation that I actually needed. But I was very fortunate because the broadcasters had done a lot of information on the radios and the TV. So I gathered all my preparation going through those different media outlets. With the broadcasts at 7 o'clock in the morning, I was there ready to go for it, getting started with the preparation that I had. And then the first person who came on was the Assistant Commissioner who provided the information for that morning. And that morning went quite well because it was nice and short and very brief. And I'd done my preparation, which had put me in good stead to do a nice interpretation. Preparation is the key for all Auslan interpreters to do good work. With the media team at Homebush, and with all the information I gathered within the head office, I was able to present the work as an interpreter quite fluidly. There were lots of challenges, though, trying to get the information, because at the start, I didn't actually understand how bushfires worked. So therefore, I asked lots and lots of questions around different reporters, different people that were actually working in head office. So as an Auslan interpreter, the key to a good interpretation is information, because you wouldn't yourself go in front of an audience without prep. Preparation is the key to a good interpretation. And I was very, very fortunate because all the bushfires were in New South Wales. And I'm a bit of a New South Wales boy, and I bleed blue, because as you know, we've got the State of Origin coming up. Working as an interpreter, being exposed to the television audience, the wider community, and the deaf community puts you in a really challenging position. And this is why it's really important, from my point of view, is to have preparation. In a perfect world, what we should have had was a month leading up to the bushfires. What we could have done was got together with a Auslan interpreting team and did some media training. This is what I felt like was missed on the day. I drew on all my experience. I've been an interpreter for 20 years, and I drew on all my experience to be able to interpret what the commissioners were saying, what the Premier was saying, and even the Prime Minister. I did lots of networking, asking lots of questions about what was being said. And the key is access. What my suggestion to all the media teams out there is that when you are talking about access, you need to have that at front of mind. It needs to be done at the start, not at the end. when you're preparing access, you need to organise the interpreters first, prepare the interpreters, getting ready for all the emergency disasters during bushfire season. Having all these training prior to the actual broadcast would make it so much easier for the interpreter to do their job. And my suggestion for the media teams out there working within the emergency realm is to ensure that access is something that's always front of mind. Because if you get your access right, that means the whole wider community is getting access to the information that is needed. Because if you get it right for the deaf community and the hard of hearing community, this means the wider community will receive the information and it works really well. Media teams need to work with Auslan interpreting teams to ensure this happens. What I found on the day was interesting because when I first started the broadcast and then when it actually finished, I went up to the media team and I said to them, I asked them, so what would you like for me to do now? And they said, oh, look, just take a seat and we'll get back to you. And I was like, oh, okay then. So I need some more information. And what I found myself doing is sitting in front of screens at the head office there at Homebush, trying to understand the tables that were on the screens. I spoke to lots of reporters that were around the media room, and I gathered all this information and I wrote it all down. And I just made sure that I was on the same track as what was being presented in the broadcasts. And you got to remember, what I want you to remember is access. Access is the key here for the deaf and hard of hearing community. I used to go into all the media rooms in the head office and there was this big, thick plate of glass between the media rooms and the main, what did they call it? The spokes, the wheel where all the communication happened for the RFS. And I would look through the window and I would look and try and work out what they were all looking at. There was lots of TV screens for me to gather all my information from. And this is quite challenging because looking through the window, I actually couldn't hear what they were all saying. And I just found myself working really hard on trying to get the prep together. My suggestion to the media teams is for each state is to try and find a liaison person who is deaf, who understands what the community needs, somebody that knows how to coordinate interpreters, somebody who could pick the appropriate interpreters on a cultural level as well. This is really important going forward. Since we've had the pandemic in the last 12 months, we've seen lots of interpreters on the screen, and we can see that the relationship between the media outlets and interpreters have improved, but it could improve again. We could raise the bar. Over in the States, what they use is they've started to realise that they're using interpreters, but deaf interpreters. So deaf people who act as interpreters. And this is becoming a trend around the world. And what's happening is that we're finding that deaf people interpret the language on a higher level and with a lot more detail. And this is quite an efficient way of getting the message across to the community. Because within the deaf community and the hard of hearing community, you remember that the audience, the age difference from the 10-year-old right through to the 90-year-old is huge. And so therefore we need to make sure that when the interpretation is being done, it's done correctly. So everybody can understand what's being said. I just want to make it really clear that, and I've probably repeated the word over and over and over, is preparation. Preparation is the key for a successful interpretation. And I just want you to understand, as media teams, it's in your good interest to make sure that you give the prep to the Auslan interpreters. We need to make sure that everything's covered off. We need to make sure that the Auslan interpreters, when they're actually interpreting, they're going to be prepared to talk about what the Commissioner or the Premier are going to be talking about, because they could be talking about other areas of New South Wales, and the interpreter could be preparing in other parts of New South Wales. And I'll give you an example. I went and got all this information because I knew that the bushfires were going really bad down south on the south coast. So I went, read up on everything on the south coast. I learned all about the different towns that were on the south coast, the different regions. And I thought, yep, I'd done all my preparation. I was ready to go. And then the assistant commissioner walked in, did the broadcast and talked about the north. And I was like, oh gosh. And then luckily, being a New South Wales person, I understood the areas that he was talking about, and I knew they were north of Tamworth. So I was very fortunate. But if I had been an interpreter who wasn't familiar with the geography of the state, it would have been a lot harder for me to interpret. And you're probably thinking, well, don't interpreters just interpret the words? There's actually more to it than that. The interpreters have to understand the tone, what the reasons behind the message that's being delivered. And there's all this other information that the interpreters need to know to be able to successfully interpret what's being said. For me, going into that environment was an incredible experience. I learned a lot. I understood that the media team were a very, very busy team. And like I'd already said, it would have been great if we could have been a part of the training leading up to the season, and we would have been better prepared. But mind you, last year's bushfires was a great turning point for media outlets to use sign language interpreters for the pandemic. It was almost like they had the training wheels on for the RFS bushfires, ready for the pandemic coming into 2020, which was nice to see. What I would like for you to really think about is when you're organising the season coming up and you're talking about communication, if you think of accessibility as being the key component first instead of last, you will benefit and everyone in the community will benefit. Generally what happens is with media teams, they often do think about Auslan interpreters, but that's generally a last thing that they do. They usually organise everything else and then they think about the Auslan interpreter. And that usually happens because somebody has prompted them or somebody has raised a point saying, oh, should we get interpreters? This is something that should be done at the start. And if you get anything from this presentation today, is that you need to think at the start of before the bushfire season and prepare your communication with the deaf and hard of hearing community, because everyone benefits. My experience with the RFS at Homebush for those 3 weeks during the summer of 1920 was a very incredible. I was actually blown away by the professionalism and the understanding of bushfires and the detail that was shared during those 3 weeks. And I felt like I was a little bit intimidated by everybody because I felt like I wasn't prepared enough. And I just wanted to make sure that going forward that this, well, hopefully it won't happen again. Hopefully that the media teams out there will be able to talk to the agencies that they've got a relationship with and set up good Auslan teams ready to go forward. So my main message here for everybody out there in the emergency services, accessibility. Accessibility needs to be thought of first and then work on the rest of it. Because if you get that right, if you get the community with the biggest barriers right, therefore everybody in the community knows what's going on. And I just want to make sure that you all understand that accessibility is for everybody. We just need to make sure that we all have the equal footings on the communication that happens out there. And this way people are safe. People feel safe. They feel like they're educated. They feel like they're getting the same information as their family members and everybody else in the community. And we need to make sure that going forward that this happens frequently and not infrequently. I just want to say thank you to Phil for inviting me here today to do this short presentation. I just want to say that all the emergencies out there, all the emergency services out there do a fantastic job. And I just want to say thank you. And remember, accessibility is the key here, and do it at the start and not at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Sean, thanks very much for your presentation. Clearly, access is vital for all of us in terms of being able to engage with the deaf community. It's also vital, of course, that we do that training, as you said before, and that we engage better ahead of emergencies and don't wait until the emergency before we work with the deaf community. And that's a great idea of yours around using a liaison officer, somebody that we can have an ongoing dialogue with, so that when the emergency happens, we're in the best possible position to look after the deaf and hard of hearing communities as emergency service members. So thank you, Sean, for your insights, and we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for some questions for Sean. We've already heard the bio for Leyla, and I'd like to invite her now to undertake her presentation. Thank you, Leyla.
Good morning, hello. My name is Leyla Craig, and I would like to say thank you to EMPA and its committee, and also to Sean for asking me to co-present this webinar today. So this presentation is Getting It Right, Tailoring Communications and Engagement between Disability Groups and Emergency Management. The deaf community still has issues in terms of access to emergency information and messaging. If we do so to the next slide, thank you. Slide 2. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a brief background on my experiences in Korea with the Disability Inclusion Disaster Risk Reduction, DIDRR. So my experiences of working in the field and internationally and locally on projects that really focus on the deaf community and emergency services and trying to look at risk reduction. So one of the projects that I have been involved in the past is about increasing the resilience of the deaf communities, increasing the resilience for New South Wales hazards for the deaf community. And I realised at that time that deaf people and hard of hearing people, their experiences, not only in Australia, but also across the world, is very, very limited. And there's such limited research on deaf people's experiences when it comes to emergencies. So I actually accepted a volunteer opportunity in the Philippines under the Australian Red Cross to work with the deaf community for a year. And that was looking as part of the DRR, the risk reduction for disaster. And the thing that really hit me was the limited resources and capacity of the deaf community over there. But I know that they're not the only community. This is very much a worldwide, global problem for deaf communities. So the research about deaf communities and emergencies is still very, very limited. There is some research on people with disabilities, so the wider disability groups, and their experiences with emergencies. But there's not, it doesn't actually show which groups that research is specifically about, whether it's people who are blind or deaf or people who have a physical disability. And it doesn't talk about the specific needs of these disability groups, whether it's the need for Auslan interpreters, guides, support workers, It doesn't go to that type of detail. So with my experiences, certainly in Australia and overseas, it's led me to study a PhD, which really focuses on the deaf community and organisations and how they can respond and support these communities in terms of emergency management. And I'm also very excited to work in the disability inclusion with Fire and Rescue New South Wales. They are very much committed to focusing on strengthening our community engagement with different disability groups, including the deaf and hard of hearing community as well. If we could go on to slide 3, please. So people with disability have a higher risk of being affected by emergencies and disasters. UNESCAP actually in 2017 had reported that people with disabilities compared to those without disabilities are 4 times more likely to die in disaster situations. And this is important. This is critical. What does the research say about this? So let's have a look at the next slide, please. So as I have said before, there is research about disabilities and emergencies. And it shows that there are 3 things to be aware of. Firstly, very much some disaster management practices are largely top-down and exclusionary, which means that people in management in these emergency services may think they know what these organisations or communities need, but they haven't gone round, they haven't consulted with them. So if we consider deaf or hard of hearing people, they're quite often excluded from the planning process when it comes to emergency services. Number 2, there's a disconnect between disability groups and emergency management and services, where both groups actually lack the skills and knowledge about each other. The third point is there's a need to change from a charity welfare model, and that needs to become a social human rights model. And this is where some people feel that people with disabilities need to be cured or fixed, where this is not the case. People with disabilities don't need to be fixed. What they need to do is have barriers broken down in order for them to participate in either emergency training, the planning process, so they can become more aware and become more prepared in terms of disasters. And then they are on a par with the communities of people without disability. So in terms of disasters, we have a look at the wider disability group. This relates, or it runs in parallel with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So if we focus on deaf communities and disasters, the research is growing. The first documented research was in 2003 from America. And those findings really showed that deaf people and hard of hearing people had fear of being unprepared. There was poor dissemination of information, and there was a lack of education in terms of emergency preparedness. 2003 that was. 18 years later, we still see these problems exist amongst deaf communities, whether it be locally here in Australia or across the globe. And we have to ask the question why. If we could go on to the next slide, please. There was one project I was involved with called Increasing the Resilience of the Deaf Community in New South Wales to Natural Hazards and Disasters. This was led by the Deaf Society, the University of New South Wales, and the state emergency agencies, wherein they collected data from the deaf community and its members in terms of emergency services and trying to identify what the deaf community's needs were, talking about their past experiences with disasters, what access they would like to see in terms of future planning, and emergency information and messaging. There were 3 key findings. Next slide, please. So the first finding is about education. So the World Federation of the Deaf actually has a quote there that only 20% of deaf people around the world have access to education, meaning 80% receive no education at all. So in Australia, there is access to education, certainly, for deaf people and hard of hearing people. However, sometimes that education is very much limited, and there may be no support in Auslan for deaf children in schools, which means that people feel isolated and excluded, and it can affect their educational outcomes. Next slide, please. If education has failed some deaf and hard of hearing people, then certainly they may have some issues around disaster literacy. So understanding preparedness information or terminologies that might be used by emergency services. Disaster literacy is really an individual's capacity to read, understand, use information, and make informed decisions following instructions in mitigating, preparing, responding, and recovering from a disaster. So we've had recent disasters in Australia and around the world, and so there's a need to consider adopting and measuring the concept of disaster literacy. And this begins really with communication. So the most important thing is communication. So research from America has shown that communication scholars and practitioners actually recommend that communications for disaster-related materials for deaf and hard of hearing people is most effective when presented in their native sign language and also in a plain language. So using, say, the maximum of a Year 4 educational level. There are also some sign languages that have established signs or formal signs for disaster terminologies, which means that deaf people may not understand the English words that they're seeing in terms of terminology. So for deaf and hard of hearing people to become disaster literate, it needs to start by an understanding of basic terminology, understanding emergency concepts, and accurate signs for disaster terminologies. So that needs to happen before you can go on to any type of disaster risk reduction training. The next slide, please. The second point is the common communication barriers. So through the project with the deaf community in New South Wales, there were discussions that were to be had in 6 different regions that brought up challenges in terms of access. Accessing information in the health, education, social and mental health services is an issue. Support on getting training on emergency preparedness and response. Challenges in being involved in local and state emergency response planning. And challenges with disaster information in terms of maybe not being in plain English. So the key recommendations have really found that there's a need to increase inclusion for deaf and hard of hearing people, deaf organisations, service providers, Auslan interpreters in all emergency and disaster planning processes. And that really avoids the chance of anybody being excluded. Our next slide, thank you. So the third and last key finding was really about the disconnect between the deaf community and emergency services. And this is about a situation where both groups do not have knowledge and skills about each other. So there are some emergency services that do acknowledge deaf and hard of hearing people, but they don't always know the best way to approach them. And this may also apply to other disabilities as well. And on the other hand, there are some deaf and hard of hearing people who assume that maybe emergency services don't want to help them or don't really have any interest in learning how to help them. Deaf and hard of hearing people certainly have a lived experience of hearing loss, which means they know the kind of help that they may need from emergency services. But at the same time, they may not have the confidence to approach these emergency services, which leads those emergency services to think that everything's okay for their community, for those communities, because there's no communication. So these are huge gaps, and it shows that there's a need for cultural and awareness training for both groups in learning how to work together, how to share knowledge, how to exchange ideas and skills, and how everybody can really work together in these emergency situations. There's also a need for communication and messaging that's really designed in this way. So the deaf community, they need to know how to prepare and how to respond and become confident in themselves in case of any type of emergency. Auslan interpreters is our second point. What information do they need? What knowledge do they need to be aware of interpreting successfully in a live interpreting situation on TV? How can they deliver the message successfully between the emergency services and making sure that the deaf community gets that message? And the third point is deaf organisations and service providers. What plans do they need to have in place as an organisation to support their staff, their volunteers and their clients who may be affected during emergency crisis? Our next slide, thank you. So let's talk about our current practices. As many of you would already be aware, you've seen Auslan interpreters and the inclusion of those interpreters and live captioning on TV during emergency broadcasts. And now it's becoming more common practice that there is this type of access, which is fantastic. It's great. And it really heightens the awareness of making sure that access is provided for everyone. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to improve this area. Most people may assume that captioning is suffice and good enough for deaf and hard of hearing people to access, and that may be true for some people, but certainly not for all. The communication needs and preferences among deaf and hard of hearing people varies and is quite diverse. Some people relying on captioning, others prefer to get their information in Auslan, and there are others that may use both types of information gathering. So for Auslan interpreters, the consistency and timing of providing those interpreters on TV and into the social media is an area that needs to be improved. Sometimes this access is not made available until a few days later. It doesn't happen straight away. And when it happens 1 or 2 days later, it means that the deaf community has missed out on important information. So it's critical to consider everybody's access needs to make sure that this information, emergency messaging, can get out to as many people as possible in a timely manner. As I said before, Auslan interpreting and captioning is fantastic, but it certainly is not enough. There still needs to be a way to empower deaf and hard of hearing communities with the skills that they need to prepare, respond, and to recover from disasters. We have some deaf and hard of hearing people that volunteer in different emergency services in Australia. And there was a project that was led by the Deaf Society of New South Wales. It was called the Get Ready Project. And it trained deaf and hard of hearing people with the skills and knowledge on emergency preparedness and how they could become bridges, communication bridges between the deaf community and emergency services. However, sustaining a project and initiative like this remains a challenge, and it shows that there needs to be more support for this to become practice and to generate interest for the deaf and hard of hearing people who wish to work as volunteers in emergency services. So One New South Wales Emergency Agency has taken the initiative to work in making disability inclusion an example of best practice within their organisation. And that's Fire and Rescue New South Wales. Next PowerPoint, please. So Fire and Rescue New South Wales are currently working on disability inclusion, where it's about strengthening community engagement between different groups. This involves reaching out to disability organisations, having conversations with them, identifying specific needs, because everybody does have a different need. And this helps Fire and Rescue New South Wales to develop and deliver fire safety education and messaging to different disability groups in a way that fits their needs. So for example, using Auslan or captioning for the deaf and hard of hearing community. So one of the activities that Fire and Rescue is working on is developing a fact sheet for firefighters. And what that means is that when they consult with disability groups, they get information from them and they developed a fact sheet that gives general information about access needs for that particular group, especially during a time of an emergency. So for example, a fact sheet on deaf and hard of hearing people for firefighters will include general information about definitions of all different types of deafness and hearing loss, people that use sign language or maybe use speech, those that become deafened later in life, resources that can be used to contact emergency services such as SMS, sign language relay services, TTYs, mobile phones, computers. So they're also developing some internal training for firefighters on safety visits to ensure that they meet the needs of people with specific disability. So a safety visit would mean that Fire and Rescue New South Wales can be visiting homes, checking on smoke alarms in the homes, and with permission, those firefighters will also check around the home and property to provide information around safety and advice. So it could be around the kitchen, heaters, fires, electricity. They'll also provide advice on a fire safety evacuation plan in case a fire happens within the home, and also how to call the emergency services if needed. So for firefighters who go to the homes of deaf and hard of hearing people, they become more aware of what those needs are, of how to communicate with people. And so that gives them more awareness and a little more confidence to either communicate themselves or get the services of an Auslan interpreter. So Fire and Safety New South Wales are also working on an education program for children with disabilities. And that involves firefighters going out to schools to educate children with disability on fire safety by showing them a child-friendly video that's accessible for all people to watch. So it may have captioning, it will have Auslan interpreters, will have plain English, audio, so it's easily accessible for everybody. Next slide, please. So there's still more work to be done to improve access within emergency public spaces. And this means that it includes understanding and interpreting disaster terminology, providing emergency preparedness training, making sure that there's access in emergency evacuation centres and shelters, training deaf and hard of hearing people to work who want to volunteer in the emergency services, and establishing a communication and support system in place to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing people who may be affected by emergencies. So all of this can be achieved if deaf and hard of hearing people have inclusion. Auslan interpreters, organisations and service providers that serve deaf and hard of hearing people, they also need to be included in local and state emergency planning. Our next slide, thank you. So I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you, Leyla, for your excellent presentation today and also for your research. Clearly, with the morbidity being so much higher for people with a disability, it's so vital that people like you are doing this research. It's concerning, of course, that there's been this lack of consultation in the past between people who are deaf and hard of hearing with the emergency services. And so good to hear that some of these barriers are now being broken down through your research with Fire and Rescue New South Wales and other emergency services. Clearly there's a need, as you said, for greater cultural awareness training and appropriate communication. And we need to do, as Sean said, more work with the interpreters to make sure they are well prepared as well. And we need to do more than just assume that if we have an interpreter and captions, the job is done. We need to make sure as emergency service communicators that the engagement is continual and that we're including planning for the inclusion of deaf communities and people who are hard of hearing in all that we're doing and not just adding this in as an afterthought. So thank you again for your research. We now have some time for some questions. The first question comes from Elizabeth Gardner. And Elizabeth has asked Leyla, is there any organisation in Australia using deaf interpreters in the media yet that we can learn of? And perhaps, Sean, this might also be one for you as well.
So at the moment, I know that we do have some deaf interpreters working in Australia, but I don't think the training is there yet. I'm not sure if they've had enough media training. You know, I think there have been some more projects, small projects done and within the emergency services, but certainly there's just need for more. I'm not sure, Sean, if you can add any more information about that.
Sorry, guys, I forgot to hit the mute button. Yeah, look, deaf interpreters, we do have them. I saw some come on to the TV from Melbourne. We have a couple of trained deaf interpreters in Melbourne. One of the organisations, Auslan Services in Melbourne, they provided a deaf interpreter. We've got deaf interpreters on our books. Generally, other organisations have deaf interpreters as well. But once again, I'd like to reiterate reiterate the fact that we need to train and provide training for interpreters, whether they're hearing or whether they're deaf, to be able to stand in front of the TV. So that's something that we definitely need to work on.
Right, thank you. The next is from Andrew Nicholas, and I think it's more a comment, but you may both like to say something as well. He says, accessibility means all people need to be included. We also need to think about deaf-blind with varying levels of deafness and blindness. One important thing I would like to see is that transcripts be available immediately afterwards as part of video broadcasts. Sean and Leyla, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with that. Yes, I agree with that statement very much. And I think it's worth thinking about what we should be doing, certainly in terms of transcripts.
The next question.
You know, more services too when it comes to deaf-blind people, you know, and I think that they need access to information as well. So we need to be committed to being able to engage with that particular group as well to find out what their specific needs are.
Yeah, and I'd also would like to support what Leyla just said. The deaf-blind community is a subgroup within our minority group, which is the deaf and hard of hearing community. And this is a group that generally gets left out. And, you know, this is something we could work towards, working together with all the emergency services and the different agencies throughout Australia to be able to provide information for that particular subgroup, which generally gets left in the dark.
The next question comes from Rebecca Hogan, and she asks, which communications form would be a priority? Would it be captioning, Auslan, or a mix of both? And this is in terms of rapidly changing information or breaking news. Sean, do you want to start with that one?
Okay. Look, the best option is the mix of both, of course. It's the way to go. But I know sometimes things happen last minute. But as long as we're striving and trying to achieve the best outcome, I think something is better than nothing. But the ultimate goal is to have both.
Leyla, do you wish to add to that?
Yes, I agree with everything Sean said there. For deaf and hard of hearing communities, it's a very diverse community. Everybody has a preference in terms of their communication needs. Some people prefer an Auslan interpreter, some people prefer captioning, and others like both. So it's hard to answer. But, you know, I think a mix of both is the optimal way to go, which covers all of the community in that case.
Thank you. Next question is from Gianni from ABC Emergency. And Gianni asks, we often rely on radio as our communication source of last resort when NBN and power fails. Is this completely inaccessible to some deaf or hard of hearing people, or is there other technology or services that can share warnings that have originally been broadcast on radio? Leyla, are you aware of anything in this regard?
That's a great question. There have been discussions about this area actually, and there's no easy answer to that. You know, if the power does go out and, you know, how are you accessing your information? What happens for a deaf person? Maybe it's a case of deaf people asking people who can hear around them, you know, to let them know what's happening on the radio. It's the old-fashioned way of doing things, but it seems to be what would happen in that kind of situation. Yeah,
I'd like to add that as well. Definitely, deaf people have always been the last people to learn of what's been happening around them. My dad used to always say to me, I'm always the last person to know what's going on, because he never used to get information until he read the paper the next day. as we're the wider community, we all have the benefits of the radio and listening to the radio. In the case of the NBN failing or the electricity dropping out, hopefully, people have their batteries all charged on their iPads and on their tablets and what have you. We're very fortunate in today's world with technology the way it is. I know for myself, I rely heavily on the radio because I'm very fortunate. I'm very fortunate that I can hear. For deaf people, they rely heavily on the internet, and they rely heavily on that instant access to the NBN. And look, you're right, Leyla. It's going back to the old ways, and that's talking to your friends and neighbours, making sure that you've got relationships with people that can pass on the information to you.
The next question comes from Elizabeth Gardner again. Thank you, Elizabeth. And she asks, have you found it easier to navigate representation from the deaf community than the hard of hearing community? There seems to be many more organisations and community groups representing the deaf community than the hard of hearing community. Sean, might get you to start with first this time.
Look, there are many organisations, but the deaf community as a whole generally works together. They all strive for the ultimate outcome of good communication. That's what we all want. I know personally with my family, I want them to have full access to communication. Is it hard to navigate? I don't think it is. I think people are generally very open-minded to coming together and working together. And you'll find that the organisations will do that. And also you've got the deaf community, you've got the hard of hearing community. The community as a whole, we've got groups within the community. And when you talk about somebody who's hard of hearing, you talk about somebody generally who's a little bit older, who's been around industrial equipment, for example, all their lives and they've lost their hearing. Or then you get the seniors who have lost their hearing as well. So, we cover that aspect of the community as well. So there's, when people think deaf and hard of hearing, it's actually quite a big population of people who need access to all these brand new technologies that are available. And this is something that's why the community strives to work together.
Leyla, did you wish to add to that?
Yes, in agreeing with Sean, I think it can be difficult at the same time too, especially for hard of hearing people and deaf people who are, we have a group of Auslan users who are a smaller group compared to people who have a hearing loss. And so I think connection with the hard of hearing community, I think it can be easier for some people to work with the hard of hearing community because of communication. But I think, deaf people have Auslan interpreters, but I think for hard of hearing people, sometimes they don't feel that they fit into the deaf community. So we really do need to try to work together and come together in these times. But I think it can be difficult to work together in some times. I think we should welcome everybody who has a hearing loss and work together, especially in terms of emergency services and what we can do in times of disaster. I think it's the same aim, as Sean said, it's about access and preferences. There is preferences about access, but it's about sharing the same goal, which is about communication for all. So I think it's important that we keep our eye on that goal so that we can work together as a wider community.
The next question comes from Rebecca Hogan, and she said, has social media been a good way to disseminate emergency information for the deaf, hard of hearing communities? And that's following on from Gianni's question. We might get you to start this time, Leyla.
Yes, I think mostly deaf and hard of hearing people rely very heavily on social media for information, for emergency messaging. And, there are some challenges that are attached to that as well. You may have an interpreter on TV, for example. Facebook may not show the interpreter. So there's the challenge. So if you're accessing your information via Facebook, for example, the interpreter's not there. Sometimes on TV you may have captioning, but on other social medias the captioning is not there. So I think it's an area that really needs to be improved to make sure that those accessibility functions are available everywhere. Sean, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to remind everybody, not everyone has access to social media. Look, it's a fantastic platform to get information out there. I mean, we've seen how well it works as a community. The deaf community rely heavily on it, but there's also a part of the deaf community that don't use social media. And I'll give you an example. My own father, who relies heavily on the TV for his information, and he lives on the South Coast during those horrible bushfires last year. And he doesn't even know how to press the space bar on a keyboard. So for people like that in the community, they rely heavily on the TV. So, but yes, the answer to your question is the social media platform is a fantastic way to get the message out.
Question from Katie Eels. Thank you, Katie. Are there initiatives for deaf blind people and deaf with additional disabilities? Might get you to start this time, Sean.
I can't answer that question, to be honest. We do have organisations out there that look after the deaf-blind community and deaf people with additional disabilities. They would be probably better off to speak to than myself. I can't speak on their behalf. But there's one thing I do know is that if we can cater for the deaf-blind community and people with extra disabilities, it generally would work for the whole of the deaf community and the hard of hearing community. So it's something that it's a discussion that needs to be had.
Thank you. Leyla, did you wish to add to that?
Yes. It's a great question that was brought up there. And I think with every emergency organisation, they really have to have strong community connections and look at those specific needs in those communities. So deaf blind people, ask what their needs are. What do they require? You know, what do they need from emergency services if an emergency situation should happen? So it's about talking to those people, finding out what their needs are, and you need to let them tell you what they need. So I think it's a worthwhile exercise to consult with those different groups about what their needs are.
Couple of last questions now. So very quickly, Linda Williams, Leyla, she has asked, can we have access to the references you mentioned in your presentation to help us identify particular challenges in an emergency that we can use to help us support our desire to assist through local government?
Yes. So I can share that with EMPA and they'll be able to disseminate that information either through the website or however they want to do that. Or you can contact me directly on my email address, which is at the end of the PowerPoint. So very happy to pass on those references and share those with you.
And one final question, also for you, Leyla. This is from Rebecca again. That statistic that you mentioned in your slide, that people with disability are 4 times more likely to die in an emergency or disaster. Has that statistic been improving over time?
Great question. It's actually hard to say because the data around the world is not easy to actually find. So I think the risk is still very high, especially for some countries who don't have any emergency planning in place or preparedness training in place, and nothing is set up for people with disability. And so it might be a lot higher there compared to other countries. There are countries that do have plans or systems and supports that have been established. So I think it would be very different around the world. But even if, you know, we can see that it is high, even if it has improved, I think there's still room for improvement, obviously.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions today and for attending our webinar. We've been delighted to have you join us today, and a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and we will make that available and let you as participants know. Just a reminder too that it's just 33 days until the EMPA conference in Sydney on the 2nd to the 4th of June. We hope that you will join us at that conference. We've got an ethical strategy workshop with Mark Crosweller on the 2nd of June, followed by our great keynotes, Dr. Norman Swan and Dr. Joe Buffone from Emergency Management Australia, and many other wonderful speakers. And finally, again, thank you to Sean Sweeney and to Leyla Craig today for their wonderful work in presenting to us. We're very grateful to you for your time, and very grateful also to our two interpreters today, and also to our person doing the captionings. We're really grateful to all of you for the wonderful work that you do, and we hope that this will lead to greater engagement between the deaf community and hard of hearing community and the emergency services. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.